Welcome to the Wordy Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
Are we ready to do a quarter blind review?
I mean, we've both read this story multiple times, and we've both listened to it even more times than that, probably. So I'm not too worried that you haven't read it this week. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. But I was supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, it's all good. So, yeah, we are finally doing our Mountains of Madness episode. We kind of promised it after our Lovecraft episode and then forgot to do it. And then got tied up, and then really forgot to do it, and then got tied up in our April episode, and
then said we were going to do it, and then you read it so that we could do it, but I did not, but that's okay.
Right. Yeah.
That's where
like I said, we've both read it multiple times. So, this is, I believe, Lovecraft's longest work.
Yes it is.
And it is...
Wait, no, is it longer than Charles Dexter Ward?
I think it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, this is it.
I can check, of course. But I'm pretty sure that this is his only book that is... Let's see, Charles Dexter Ward. Well, no, maybe not. No, Charles Dexter Ward is longer. By like 20 pages. Yeah, okay. So this might be his second longest work. Maybe we should do an episode on Charles Dexter Ward.
We did talk about that one a bit last time, but we could do that. We could definitely do a full episode on that. I would have to reread that one again, because I've only read that one twice, and it was a long time ago.
Yeah, that one I've read once fairly recently, but not, like, when I say fairly recently, I mean, like, last year. So, yeah, we would both definitely need to read... Anyway.
These are the inner workings of...
These are the inner workings of the Wordy Pair podcast. We're both fumblers, basically. But especially you.
Well, okay, so sometimes it's just my computer that's a fumbler and not me.
Uh-huh.
But we also don't need to go into the fun sound issues that you get to edit.
Well, I mean, like, the microphone problem, I can't edit those. Those are just they're mixed in with words, so I can't do anything about it. But anyway, let's talk.
I will figure that out.
Let's talk at the Mountains of Madness.
Yeah, I mean, all those sounds that you're hearing, they're really just echoes of the old ones coming through your stereo receiver.
Oh, that's a good point.
Into your ears, grinding away daily, breaking you down into the madness that embodies us all.
What if I'm the only one that hears them?
What if you're the only one doing this podcast?
Oh, God.
I mean, I know I would listen, except I wouldn't, because I wouldn't be here.
Well, you would, because you would be me.
No, I would be a figment of your imagination.
Right, that's the same thing as being me.
Honestly, you can't put that on job resumes and expect to get hired, to be honest.
I would definitely recommend against it. Yes.
Yeah. So, The Mountains of Madness.
At the Mountains of Madness is Lovecraft's second longest work, and
my favorite.
And probably my favorite too, actually. It's extremely it is the definition of the slow burn horror story with a very strong scientific or like hard science feel to especially the early parts of it. Yeah, it's
the first chapter, if we're going to call them chapters, the first part.
There are chapters.
Is it's kind of fun how he's kind of doing it in a diary style.
Yes.
Of someone who experienced all these events, and he wants to explain. He opens the story by talking about how there's this new expedition going to Antarctica
Yes.
in the same area that they had gone to.
Specifically, they were encouraged to go by the reports that they made publicly of their trip.
Yes, and the person that you're getting the story from wants to prevent any research from anyone from going out there and trying to discover more, and has been holding off for a long time telling anyone, but has decided that in the interest of stopping anyone from going to visit again, the story needs to be told in its fullest. So you already know at the very beginning that something different happened than what was actually reported when these people came back from their expedition.
And it was something that would make anyone who experienced it try to prevent anyone else from making the same mistake, basically.
Yeah, and what makes that so great is everything that happens for like the next 30 pages after that, you have that in the back of your mind. Because for a long time following this part of the book, you're learning about how they started the expedition, how everyone was, what they prepared for, what they brought with them, the types of scientists that went, the equipment that they have. This is almost all of the first chapter.
Yeah.
Is this, and talking about how one of the scientists made a discovery that didn't really, wasn't anything like fantastic, really, other than they thought it would lead to something fantastic. And that kind of like is how the first chapter ends, where they have this realization that wait
you're
a
not
minute.
Using the chapter headings, because there are chapter headings in the book, in the story, but now you're kind of separating into rough parts, which is not the same thing. Anyway,
yeah, that's I don't remember the chapter headings.
Yeah, it's fine. They're not particularly noticeable, but except in my copy, in my hard copy of it, they used the chapter heading 7 twice, and I was like, well, that's odd.
I don't think I noticed that when I read it, but
it's in my hard copy. I think it's a misprint.
Yeah, it's broken up into these chunks of story written as like a short form diary from part to part.
Yes,
but it's what it's like 100 some pages total.
It's a little under 100 pages. Yeah.
So what do we actually want to say about it, though, that would make someone
first
possibly want to investigate
Let's
it?
first underline the fact that in this story, Lovecraft is writing as a professor of geology. That is the character that he is playing, effectively. The POV character is a professor of geology who is the nominal head of this expedition out into Antarctica. They're going with the intention of looking for rock samples, so they're prepared to deal with looking for rock samples. However, they do have a few other professors on board. One of them is a biologist, Lake, and he is kind of it'd be wrong to call him an antagonist, but he does have some slightly antagonistic perspectives, or not perspectives, but positions during the first part of the story. It's very interesting because you get this, how to put it, you get this notion that they're looking for interesting geology stuff, and basically they get to Antarctica and they find something that Lake thinks is really interesting, and basically they find what look like like striated fossils in some I think it's shale. I forget what kind of rock it is, but there's a lot of geological jargon. There's a lot of eons of the Earth history jargon in this story. It's actually a very like high level written story, and you can tell that Lovecraft either did a lot of research for it or had a pre-existing love and knowledge of this stuff that he could write about it so convincingly as if he were a professor of geology.
Well, let's be honest. This was like 1920s-ish, 1930s, sometime around then. I mean, geology was probably part of a general education back then, so that very well could have been the case.
Well, maybe.
I only say that. I suspect that's the case because one of the things that I've done lately is gone around to antique stores and looked at old books, and the school books that people had back then were so chock full of information about everything that it's just it puts modern school books to shame.
Yeah.
Like I found a single book that was like, here is everything you need to know about farming, and it literally went through everything up to and including like animal breeding and all sorts of very small print, of course, but still just crammed into one book. I think that there's a lot more that can be learned these days because we've discovered so much. I think that perhaps people got a very, very hardened education in older times because, it was very focused. I think it was more focused.
Well, there was more of a... I mean, we could get into a discussion about the American education system over the last 100 to 200 years, but that's probably outside the scope of...
But that's not as fun.
Well, it's not as fun, and it's also outside the scope of this podcast.
Yeah. Well, it's just pointing out he does use a lot of facts about geology to indicate why these scientists behaved the way that they did. I mean, Blake basically mutinies this expedition.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, this isn't where we were supposed to go. We're not heading out in this direction. He's like, I'm gonna.
Basically. It's a very short-lived antagonism because once Lake starts to actually find the things that are actually interesting and continues to find interesting things, the POV character does kind of acquiesce and say, yeah, you're right, this is pretty interesting. We should probably look into it before we worry about the rocks. We can deal with the rocks later.
Yeah, they pretty much celebrate
they do.
Right away
does.
when they discover a mountain chain that hadn't been discovered, and it's huge mountains. Yep. They're like, oh, this alone is worth it.
Yeah.
And in the course of the another part of the book, another early part of the book, they do some drilling with a special boring machine that they brought with them.
Yes.
That what was the guy that operated that?
Well, the guy who invented it was Pabity.
Yeah, and they drilled out and found a cave that had all these fossils in it from various time periods that implied that there was...
You're getting ahead of yourself because the cave that they find doesn't just contain fossils. It contains specimens of basically 10-foot tall creatures. I think they find 6 of them that are damaged and 8 of them that are in very good condition. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here because we're kind of skipping to the middle part of the story where the action actually happens.
Oh no, that's only a couple pages. That's maybe 15 pages in when they get to that, I think.
No.
Because that's at least within the first quarter of the story.
I don't think it's in the first...
Oh no, that is. It's like right around maybe it's not 20 pages, but maybe 30. I don't know. You might have a different print size than I have.
Well, I mean, my print copy is about 90 pages. And...
Okay, so it would be about... You'd have to be there by 30 pages. You'd have to be where they're drilling and they find the... They find the fossils, like mixed up fossils of mammoths and dinosaurs and things that shouldn't be in time periods together, and yet somehow had ended up in this cave. They theorized that things were washed into this cave through a system of channels underground that perhaps were more extensive than they thought and might even run up under the mountains, which is where the story starts to get interesting. And for anyone that's really interested in a lot of the Cthulhu mythos stuff, this actually plays a very central role to everything revolving around the elder gods, or what is it they're called? The old ones are in the story, but they're not the... They're not like the Cthulhu and Azathoth.
No, they're the great ones, I think, right?
The great ones, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of mythology in this one, basically, where just to kind of move forward, what happens is that they find what's effectively a city of these great ones, and the great ones and the old ones were fighting with each other, and the great ones are the specimens that they find, and the old ones are the ones that basically forced them to remain in the Antarctic areas or under the ocean. The great ones, Lovecraft says, came from Pluto, and no, the old ones came from Pluto, and the great ones were here before them, kind of thing. He says that the old ones are remembered as like the abominable snowman and things like that. So.
Well, there were a lot of references throughout the story to things like the Necronomicon. Like one of the early mentions of it is during one of the reports that Blake is making.
Lake. Yeah.
What did I say?
Blake.
Oh, I've been watching too much Mystery of the Druids.
Okay. Fair enough.
So Lake is sending back a report, and he's talking about these specimens he found at one point, and he mentions that they resemble creatures that were described in, like some fanciful things like the Necronomicon.
Yeah.
He kind of like offhand says it like, it's just coincidence, which is why he gives them the name, the what was it, the Elder Ones or
Great Ones.
The Great Ones, yeah.
Well, so
I always get those mixed up.
So, well, they're very they're
the
fictional.
Great Ones, the Elder Ones, the yellowish ones, the ones
or maybe
with
it
a
is
tinge
the old
of
ones.
sulfur scent.
I thought
it was the old ones.
Well, so this
the
is funny
elder
because
things.
I just read Shadow Out of Time, and I think that there's so many different mythological like old creature things that it must be the old ones. I think I was confused because I just read Shadow Out of Time, which is about the Great Ones and their interactions with the old ones. Long story.
Yeah, because I don't think the abominable snowmen were the old ones. Those were the Migo, I think.
Well, the Migo is the abominable snowman.
Yeah,
and those are the ones that fought with the old ones. The old ones are the ones that Lake finds, I guess.
Yeah, they're very rubbery, barrely looking creatures
Right.
that you can imagine wibble wobbling everywhere on land. Apparently, they could swim through space at one point, but they forgot how. And then
This
they were
is an
under the
interesting.
ocean.
This is an interesting theme of Lovecraft's work, persistent in a lot of his stuff, is the idea of decadence.
Yeah,
And basically, in the latter part of the story, we learn basically they explore this city, and somehow they manage to decipher all of these. What would you call them? Engravings?
yeah. The carvings on the walls of the ancient city that they stumble across.
Right.
Somehow they translate them like from pictograms and pictures.
Group dots.
They get an idea of what is going on, but they don't explain how they translate it.
Yeah,
which
it's
is
one of those
fine
things that
because-
I think is probably best left a little bit hazy, because basically there wouldn't be much of a story without it, in the sense that, like, well, there wouldn't be much of a backstory without it, because what we would be missing, what we learn, or what Lovecraft's POV character learns, is that basically these creatures inhabited the ocean and much of the earth, a couple 100 million years ago, and over time, the people from Pluto came and pushed them back to the ocean and to Antarctica, and so and basically these old ones, they used to have a bunch of really amazing technology. They used to have the ability to fly through space. They used to have the ability to inhabit the entirety of the Earth. They used to have the ability to like look through time and things like that. And all of these abilities kind of got lost over the course of millions of years, to the point where the last living ones who were in the city, kind of in the 500,000 year ago period or something like that. I think I might be getting that time frame wrong, but like before the city became abandoned, the last group basically didn't have any of this technology left over, and they were basically, and even their art suffered and things like that. He talks about how, they find some of the really old stuff and they're like, wow, this stuff is really amazing. The way that it's carved and the way that it's written and the way that they, weave everything together. And then he contrasts it with the more recent carvings, where they basically either carved, clumsily into the walls, or they erased something that was already in the wall to carve under it, basically. So
I'm not sure that's what happened. If I remember correctly, what they came across. So they spent a large time in this city looking at all of these carvings and drawings.
Yeah.
Or it's implied that they were there a long time because they managed to unfold this entire history of the old ones.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they brought up was that the old ones had done something horrific and created the Shoggoth, which is a creature that Alhazred talked about in the Necronomicon.
Well, they created the Shoggoth early on. The problem is that they lost the ability to control them.
Yeah, and so the Shoggoth, he implied in the story at some point that the Shoggoth had begun trying to mimic their creators and were probably the ones that had carved in the later images, trying to reproduce their art and trace some of their own history out, because there was a great war between them, between the Shoggoth and the old ones.
Mm-hmm.
When the Shoggoth, they managed to stabilize their brains to a point at which they could have some semblance of free will.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, he leaves it open that the new carvings could either be the Shoggoths or it could be the last remnants of the old ones. But in any case, they're greatly deteriorated in quality from the older stuff.
Yeah,
and this is that decadence theme that is present in almost all of Lovecraft, right? Like when we did the Lovecraft episode, we talked about the story with the man lost in the cave, and yeah, that was a story of decadence. There was a man who got trapped in the cave and devolved into a clawed beast. We have the stories about like great sorcerers dying and then nobody knowing how to stop them from coming back because of the decadence of modern knowledge. We have stuff like that. So yeah, that's
the deep ones.
Yes.
That was kind of inadvertently becoming decadent just because they lived in a town where they didn't really need anything to maintain any level of technology. They had a whole undersea world that they all knew about and nobody else did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting theme to a lot of what Lovecraft does, because a lot of the story is implying that the old ones came to Earth and they already have technology at that point far better than anything that human beings have.
Right.
They may have been the ones that created human beings, just as something to do work for them.
So it's either that they created human beings or they created some earlier life that then evolved on
primates.
its own. I mean, he says quite explicitly in the book that the old ones were the ones that created life on Earth other than themselves, basically.
Okay. Yeah. So the very fact of their existence now as these scientific researchers is, they're looking at, well, they're not necessarily looking at it like this, but it's like they created what we became.
Right.
And so what does that make them and what does that really make us? And I don't know, should we keep jumping around like this, or do we want to like jump back a bit and maybe progress through it a bit? Because there's a lot to this story.
There's a lot to this story, yeah. I mean,
it's all over the place. They get to these mountains that they call the Mountains of Madness.
Hold on, we're all over the place. The story is not all over the place. The story is a really, really good build up and slow burn.
Yeah, it's all over the place in terms of how much mythology it has in it.
Lovecraft in general is all over the place on his mythology, but that's all right. No, I mean, there's a lot of... I mean, in the early part of the story, there's a lot that's just about their experience as they make their way to Antarctica and as they start exploring the continent. There's a lot of details about longitudes and latitudes, and they establish the main character's connection to one of the graduate students, a guy named Danforth. Because they, of everyone on the expedition, those two are the ones who have read the Necronomicon in the library and know a lot about this kind of like old stuff. Nobody else on the expedition really seems to have any grasp of any of that, but these two do, and they're the ones that, not coincidentally, they're the two that go and find the city and explore it.
Yeah, there's degrees of separation of knowledge here, too, because while the whole crew is aware that something weird is going on at one point, there's only two characters that delve so deep into it that they get practically the full story. And even then, they find things that are just like...
Well, there's a couple of stages of this, right? So okay, so let's just kind of... Let me just kind of run this out. They get to Antarctica, they start digging, they start moving. Lake finds something that he thinks is interesting. Lake then kind of usurps the command of the thing, and he goes in a different direction from where they were planning on going. Lake sets up a camp. He starts digging in this new area where he found this giant mountain range, right? Then, in the course of the digging, they basically find a cave. They dig into a cave, and they start exploring the cave. They find these specimens. They start to dissect one of the specimens. The dogs don't like the specimens. They've got all these little soapstone artifacts. The dogs don't like those either. And basically what happens is that they kind of finish their work for a day, and they all go to sleep, and the next morning, no one can get a hold of them. The whaling ship that brought them there can't get a hold of Lake's team. The main character and Danforth and the few people that are with them can't get a hold of Lake's team, so they have one airplane left. They bring 5 of these Dornier airplanes, custom Dornier airplanes, and they only have one left. So they fly that to where Lake is, and they basically find the camp completely annihilated, completely destroyed. Everyone is dead. All the dogs are dead. One person is missing. One dog is missing. A lot of equipment is missing.
Let's talk about that whole thing for a minute in
Okay.
terms of writing.
Sure.
The way that Lovecraft presents that
Yeah.
is, it's incredibly fun. Just to generalize, the feeling that you get when you're reading it, because at first it's a lot of like by the numbers scientific procedure.
Yeah.
And as they're making these discoveries, radio transmissions are being sent back and forth between the team that is there, the team that finds these specimens,
Lake's
the team
team.
that is dissecting and Lake's team, dissecting and working on these specimens. And they drop some strange facts on you. Lovecraft is in the middle of these dissections and these discoveries. He's constantly bringing up the dogs barking and being uncomfortable. And at one point, Lake is sending back a transmission where he says they had to build a corral for the dogs far away from the specimens because they're absolutely going crazy over them.
Yeah.
And this whole time, it's largely just scientific procedure. Let's grab some of these specimens, these giant, what are they, 9 foot, I think, barrel-shaped things that they throw onto the back of sleds, and
Yeah.
they had to have men drag them back to the camp because the dogs wouldn't want to be near them, or they'd want to rip them apart.
Right.
So everyone on the other end is getting all of this information about the dogs and everything. There's nothing. It's a little weird with the dogs, but everything else is just like everyone's celebrating. You can practically picture them popping champagne bottles open, like, oh man, we found something amazing. And Lake says this is, on the level of something like Einstein's relativity.
Yeah.
Then there's a snowstorm, high winds blow. I guess it's more like a windstorm, but they say it's a snowstorm blowing off the mountains.
It's a windstorm that's blowing down from the mountains that Lake's team is at, and there's a lot of detail for a little while about the main character's team's experience with this windstorm, and they're like, man, if this windstorm is this bad here and it's coming from the mountains, how bad is it that close to the mountains? We hope Lake's team is okay, kind of thing. So there's a little setup there. It's nice.
Yeah, it's a great setup right there just for what happens next, because at this point, they wake up the next morning, they can't get in touch with the camp, and the assumption is, oh, something bad might have happened, we need to go check it out. Big snowstorm, probably could be trouble getting communications, people could be hurt, we don't know what's going on, we've got to go investigate. So they put together a plane and a team, and they head out, and when they get there, it is nothing like what they would have expected the real problem would be. However, this is an important part to everything that happens in the story and what happened at the beginning of the story.
Right.
Because this is the part of the story where the person that is narrating it, the person telling the story, is changing events according to himself once they return. When they return, they tell everyone a totally different story about what happened.
Yes.
And he is hesitant at this point in the story to even tell the reader or the audience he's addressing what really happened. And he doesn't say anything about what really happened just yet. He refrains from doing so until a further part in the story.
So, I mean, he describes there definitely was damage from the windstorm. But he starts to find discrepancies between what the windstorm would have done and what has actually happened at the camp. And he does detail these parts in detail in the story at that point. He's basically saying, yeah, I mean, like, a couple of the tents were knocked over, and the dog thing was messed up, but that could have just been from the dogs trying to jump out or something. And then, well, wait a minute, there's a couple of sleds missing. Like, why would the sleds be missing? The sleds shouldn't be missing. Little things build up like that.
There's a few omissions. There's a few omissions before he because later in the story he says exactly what they found in the camp. There's a whole build up to that where he says, but finally I think I have to reveal what we really came across in all of this, because he doesn't mention the whole chopping up of limbs and things being ripped open, like cans cut open and things like that right away.
Yeah, he does.
No, it's in a. Okay, you know what? You've read it more recently than me. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't know what did it. That's the thing, is that he's like, this is weird. Some of these cans are opened up, but they're opened up in a weird way, and somebody was using a bunch of matches, and there's smudges on these books, and a bunch of books are missing. Like, he doesn't tell you what he thinks did it until that point. It's just like,
yeah, he holds off and says he mentions that they have some strange suspicions between all of them, but nobody is bringing it up.
Well, because they don't have any evidence that anything happened other than a windstorm. It's just that the point of the build up there is that they're like, well, it looks like the windstorm got them, except for this and this and this. I mean, I guess that could, but then there's this, and it's like, well, I don't know, whatever.
But then there's also the specimens being found upright in the snow, which
Lake found 8 specimens that were in perfect condition. He claims, and I think 6 or 7 that were noticeably injured, to the point of being, destroyed. And what they find is the damaged specimens all buried. They're buried vertically in 9-foot deep, snow pits. And there's a bunch of dot-based lettering on the snow around them, and some of those soapstone fragments too. And what he originally attributes it to is, he's like, well, maybe the one guy who was missing went nuts and he did this, right? Like that. There's kind of a little bit of that. Like, I don't think he could have done this, but a madman may have done this. So we need more information. And
so they decide to go find more information.
Yes. Well, so what ends up happening is that they a bunch of the planes are damaged. So everybody except for the main character and Danforth start working on the planes and start kind of gathering things up and loading them up to head home, basically. And the main character and Danforth take one of the planes, and they're like, well, we're going to go look for Gedney, who is the guy who's missing. And they start flying around, basically.
I think that, just to jump back for a second, it's important to point out that when they were flying to the camp to see what happened, there was this brief description of this illusion that was painted on the clouds as they were flying. It was kind of like a bit hard to see, a bit foggy going through, and there was just this weird illusion that some of them saw.
Yeah.
And it kind of described something that would turn out to be a little bit more of a reality later on, like almost a vision of a city.
Well, they see that mirage several times. They see it when they're still on the whaling ship too. It's just that they kind of attribute it to, it's just the sun reflecting off of something funny, and it probably is because they're a couple hundred miles away from where Lake's team eventually, perishes.
Yeah, well, and they attribute it to that, but the reader is a few steps ahead at this point, because you've already been sitting through. Of course, as the reader, something weird is going to happen in this story, but you've already been sitting through the descriptions coming back over the radio from Lake, talking about, was it Lake or was it Gedney that was in the plane? He said he was taking the plane up to look at the mountains, and they were seeing things that looked like vertical. They were seeing ramparts, basically, and it's just like, it must be some strange weathering. Yeah. It's almost like there's doors carved out of the side of the mountain, and something from, what was it, looks like something out of a
Roerich.
Yeah, and
who is a real painter.
Yes, and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Roerich was contemporary with Lovecraft, and he actually drew a lot of paintings based on some of the things that Lovecraft wrote. I'd have to look that up, though. I feel like there was something about...
I looked up Nicholas Roerich, and I didn't find any... he was a Russian painter and writer, and he was contemporary with Lovecraft, but I don't think that they interacted with each other, as far as I can tell.
I vaguely remember something about Lovecraft's circle of friends. Like, I don't know, maybe if it was, what was it? It wasn't Algernon Blackwood or someone who had also brought up Roerich several times when they were discussing various, like, Lovecraftian mythological style things. They would someone else referred to Roerich as well.
Yeah.
But, they've got this description of a guy flying past these mountains, talking about how high they were, and he's trying to get up as high as he can to see. They're flying kind of close, but they're too far away to get a perfect visual, but it's just weird how some of it looks. But then they attribute it to weathering.
Yeah, well, so I'm looking at a painting right now. It's called Shelkard Zong in 1928 that was painted by Nicholas Roerich. And there's these square, vertical, basically castles kind of nestled into the side of a mountain. And this is the kind of the motif that Lovecraft refers to multiple times throughout the story, and in other stories as well.
So yeah, you've got these guys that are witnessing mirages. They're seeing weird things in mountains. They're flying to a camp thinking that it's a snowstorm, and then they get there, and on top of everything else they've discovered, and the implications of some of their discoveries are that there might be things older on the planet than they initially assumed.
Yeah.
They start to find weird things at this camp where everyone's dead, and like you said, Gedney and one of the dogs and sleds had gone missing.
Yeah, there's a bunch of missing equipment. There's like a missing gasoline generator. There's a bunch of stuff missing that shouldn't be missing, and they don't say why they think it's missing. They don't like say it must be the monsters took it. It's like, well, maybe Gedney tried to find safety or shelter somewhere and he took some of this stuff with him. It's left open to that, basically.
Yeah.
And it's done less clumsily than I just described it, for sure.
Well, this is the part of the story where, honestly, everything up until that point, that's my favorite part of the story.
Yeah.
It's so methodical as he goes through, and it's very descriptive, each scene of what they're finding and what everyone's discovering and what everyone's doing. You really get a sense of a scientific team out in the middle of nowhere performing this drilling operation, and these guys dragging these 9-foot creatures on sleds back to a camp. It's great stuff.
Yeah, it's all very well described. It's all very clear. It's all very, like, carefully explained. There's a lot of background. There's a lot of description. There's a lot of the main character's opinions about stuff. It's an incredibly fun first half of the story, despite the fact that it's before any of the actual action happens.
Despite the fact that the meat of the story comes next.
Yeah.
Quite literally in a few cases. So this is where the narrator and Danforth set out on a plane to go explore these mountains. Now keep in mind that whoever was in the plane, I really can't remember, initially had described the mountains and said that he had mentioned they stretched on like as far as the eye could see.
Yeah.
And he couldn't really find a way to get over them because they were so high and there was too much bit too much wind at the moment.
Right.
So now the narrator and Danforth are going to try and see what else they can find over these mountains while the other folks with them are, trying to repair the planes, get everything gathered up, see what's going on.
Yeah.
And this becomes, for the rest of the story, a story of the narrator and Danforth as they come over the lip of the mountains and they find just beyond where the first explorer had been able to see the strangest vision that their scientific minds could possibly come across. And for all the world, it looks like ancient spiring towers comprising a city that looks like something out of this world.
Well, so they basically stumble upon a pass, and they can fly through the pass. They can't fly over the mountains are too high, but they can fly through this pass that they find. And that pass leads them to the city. Yeah.
Yeah, this is where the exploration part of the story really gets fun. they managed to land
Well,
their plane.
So real quick before we get there, when the narrator and Danforth get up in the air on their own, the narrator kind of has an aside moment where he's like, "Oh, by the way, everything that you've heard is not what really happened. Danforth and I decided between the two of us to not describe in truth what we actually saw in the preceding exploration of this area. So everything that you've heard up until now has been censored, and now I'm going to tell you what I know. And even Danforth won't tell me everything he knows because we're so worried about people being curious and trying to go confirm it, basically."
Yeah, there's a little bit of a mention that Danforth had likely seen something that the narrator did not, but he wouldn't speak of it.
Right.
And the narrator didn't know why and wished that he would.
Yes.
But yeah, that is their motivation, is to prevent anyone from finding out just how crazy things got. Because what they discover during their time exploring this city leads them to the conclusion that humanity could try to visit this place and awaken something that will destroy the world.
Right.
Which the Mountains of Madness itself, they're in the middle of a city that's beyond these massive mountains that they've discovered, which are now, they've found mountains that are taller than any on Earth at this point.
Yeah.
But they're not the true Mountains of Madness.
Nope.
That's the fun little twist at the end. Not really a twist, but the progression of the story it's almost, in a weird sense, it's like the scientific equivalent of raising the stakes in an action movie.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because it just keeps getting weirder and weirder and more outlandish. And at first you think you're just dealing with some weird monster, and the next thing you know, you're dealing with an entire species that came before man and was from another planet. And then you're dealing with other weird species. But this is what happens. They get to the city and they start exploring. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it in the city that they found Gedney?
Yes.
Or was okay? I couldn't.
I mean,
remember
they go underground. The city is largely damaged at the surface, but they managed to find some pathways that lead deeper into the lower parts of the city, and those lower parts of the city have not been destroyed, basically. And so they start looking around, and they start just documenting what they're finding. They brought cameras, they brought flashlights, they brought notebooks, and they kind of spend some time, taking pictures of things, making sketches of things, and they describe all of this stuff as they're kind of working their way deeper into the city. They're using paper to basically create a trail of breadcrumbs for them to find their own way out. And they're going deeper and deeper into the city, and they're describing all of these murals and markings on the walls, and they're observing how these markings are getting more and more complex as they go deeper. And they're getting older too. Somehow they have the ability to age these, to like describe, to figure out how old these things are. Probably based on what kind of rock they are for the most part, but basically, as they go deeper, they keep finding these disturbing trends that, first off, they're learning the history of the city. And this city was where the old ones lived. The old ones had the ability to live under the water, and they also had the ability to live on land, and this was one of their on-land cities, right? And they're kind of understanding the history of the city based on these murals that they're seeing as they proceed through. And then, some of the murals actually look like they have a map. And so they start to say, hey, we actually have a map of this city now. Maybe we can, find one of these shafts that goes deeper. Because, these guys, from what we understand, the old ones, when the old ones were threatened, their first defense was basically to go deeper underground or under the ocean, where they were more capable of handling themselves as compared to any other invaders. And so they basically say, hey, it looks like there's a path that leads deep underground, about a quarter mile away. And so they start making their way towards that path. And what they basically find is they find this giant cylindrical shaft cut deep into the earth with a staircase on the inside of it. And that's where they start to find other paths off of this cylinder. They don't go all the way down the cylinder, but they kind of explore a little bit. And one of the things they find is that they start smelling a couple of strange smells. One of them is the smell of the specimens that were at Lake's camp, and the other one is gasoline. So
and
they follow the trail of gasoline, and they find one of the sleds. And Gedney and the dog are on the sled, both dead, both with their throats cut, and both bandaged and wrapped up as if they are being kept as scientific specimens.
This is one of the fun twists of the story, where now you have the narrator and Danforth pretty much come to the conclusion that the specimens that were found, some of them were still alive and just had been frozen in some kind of long state of inactivity, so that they could survive underground. They're described as very resilient when they're being dissected, and it's kind of assumed that they would be able to survive in a deep freeze and reawaken. It did mention how they had the heaters running in the tents, and the specimens were kind of thawing out and starting to smell bad, and that was driving the dogs crazy.
Right.
So Danforth and the narrator can now imagine in their heads that these creatures had come back to life, found that some of them were, they're dead, being cut open, and there were these new creatures surrounding them, and they didn't know what they were, but they defended themselves, and then they became curious after essentially the creatures killed everyone at the camp.
Yeah.
So this is the old ones, as they were named by Lake, were awakened and decided to start experimenting after, fending off an attack from human beings and dogs, which they probably didn't even recognize.
Right.
And they took a specimen with them, being Gedney and one of the dogs, on a sled. And there were lots of little interesting bits, like how they had not been able to figure out canned food. They had cut it open in weird ways and possibly tested it. At one point in the story, closer to the end, but at some point, the narrator says that in the end, for as weird as they were, the old ones weren't much different than us. They were basically men.
Yeah, he says
like us.
He says, so the reason that he does that is because he's contrasting them with the Shoggoths.
Yes.
He's like, well, whatever these things were, they were men. They were us. But what they faced was not us, and that's the problem. That's the scary part. Is that it's bad enough to be, to find some aliens in suspended animation, and not alien, well, maybe aliens in suspended animation, and be killed by them. It's another thing to be turned into featureless biological goo by something that only knows how to, to imitate and consume.
Yes. And it's pretty interesting to read through it, and you can almost get the sense that the narrator is thinking, based on everything they discover, that, had things turned out differently, they could have found ways to communicate with the old ones. And
yeah, I mean, so he makes the point that the old ones took a bunch of their books and appeared to be trying to read them. There's a pile of books that have been fiddled with at the camp, and then they find another large pile of books on the sled, and there's also like a pile of them in like a little like campsite where what appears to have happened is that the old ones had basically used gasoline and maybe some of the books to create like a campsite for themselves inside the city.
Yes, and it's one of the master strokes of Lovecraft that, for someone who's known for his unknown horror, he presented so many different stages of horror in this story. He starts with the old ones as a known horror, described and shown, tactily, cut open and experimented on. And then he moves on to the Shoggoth, which becomes a known horror in the story, starting with, carvings throughout the city and different murals and things that depict the old ones creating the Shoggoth and having them, they use them as a labor force, essentially, to build their undersea cities, and then eventually their above ground cities. But then he takes what Lovecraft is known for, and he includes the unknown horror in a few brief descriptions of carvings that they find of the old ones cowering in fear at something looming at them from a much further and larger mountain range that you do not get to see the horror that they're cowering from in the carvings.
Yeah.
It's something that's left entirely to Danforth and the narrator's imagination. It's just they were terrified of something from this mountain range, and we don't know what it is. Yeah, so you have what you thought was the real horror of the story, and there's something that horrifies that horror.
Right.
It's a good scaling up. I think they make brief mention of Cthulhu at some point, and that they have
the Nicontic manuscripts. They have Tsathoggua. They all kind of make an appearance here because basically what's happening is that the narrator is trying to make sense of what is happening or what has happened and what he's seen based on these books that he's read or read about, talking about stuff that predates mankind, basically.
I'm trying to remember if it was in the Mountains of Madness or another story where they talked about how it's a good way to get an idea of just how dangerous the Shoggoth were. They talked about the war where Cthulhu descended to Earth and chased a lot of the old ones away and claimed, claimed a space in Antarctica.
Yeah.
And even the Shoggoth were no match for mighty Cthulhu, is one of the descriptions in one of the stories. I'm not even sure if it's a Lovecraft story now that I think about it. It might have been in Mountains of Madness, but I don't think it was directly talking.
There's not much about Cthulhu in Mountains of Madness, as far as I remember.
I think he's named maybe once, but he's not really talked about.
They don't say that they're worried about him in particular. Like it's not clear what this other mountain range that they're worried about is.
Yeah, I must be thinking of a different story then. There is a story somewhere that talks about the mini Cthulhus, basically the Cthulhu race, were one of the creatures that were at these mountains, but I don't think it was actually in Mountains of Madness, and it might not have even been a Lovecraft story. Might have been. There was a lot of, I can't really call it fan fiction, because these were all authors that wrote about each other's stuff all the time, but the Cthulhu mythology was fleshed out pretty deeply by that group of people initially, and then it just became a worldwide phenomenon of people writing their own stuff. But yes, the Shoggoth were talked about in the story as being something so horrific and so dangerous that even Alhazred in the Necronomicon said no one would dare create one on Earth. They don't exist anywhere on Earth, and yet we discover here they are.
Yep. Well, so what happens is that they keep going deeper into the city. They're looking for this shaft that leads down into what they suspect is like an underground ocean, where maybe these old ones, maybe they're headed there because they'll be more comfortable in the deep waters, right? And what they find, to their surprise, is 4 of the old ones' bodies. They're all cut up now too. And it didn't look like it was done by their friends. It looked like it was done by something else.
Yeah, and there's also I don't think we didn't mention the penguins, did we? They came across these giant penguins.
There's a little bit of a false jump scare where they're kind of walking deeper and they see something like, oh god, Shoggoth, and it's like, oh no, it's a penguin. It's just a big albino penguin.
But the penguins are there for curious reasons. There's a point in the story at which the penguins are fleeing from something, and this alerts them to the presence of some danger. I don't know. This is kind of the part of the story I'm fuzzy on, so you will have to pick up from here. I remember the ending, like everything with the Shoggoth, but everything from here in between is a bit foggy for me. So what you got?
Yeah, I mean, it's they find these penguins, and the penguins are these huge albino penguins. They're sightless. They don't seem they scare them at first, and they're like, oh, these guys don't seem to be a danger. So they keep going deeper. They find the dead old ones, and then they smell something new. It's not the old ones, and it's not gasoline. It's something else. And they're like, I don't like this. I don't like this new smell either. And then finally, basically, they basically the Shoggoth basically starts to chase them, and so they basically they don't really see it per se. They I think one of them mentions possibly getting a glimpse of it, something like that.
No,
But like
they
just
do
barely.
see it. Just
Yeah.
it is just barely, just a fleeting glance.
Just a very
at something.
fleeting glance of it, and they just run like hell. And they run all the way up out to that big cylinder that they were at before, and they basically say, pure luck. It looks like the Shoggoth took a wrong turn somewhere, and we didn't. So we got out, and it did not find us. And so they make their way up, and instead of trying to make their way out through the city like the way that they came in, they're like, oh, we can just go to the top of this column and head out that way probably. So they do that.
Well, they get back to their plane. At the
Right,
very
that's
end.
how they get... Well, but the point is that they get back to their plane through a different pathway. They came in through the city, and then they leave through that cylinder, and they didn't enter through the cylinder. They entered through somewhere else. And they make a couple... he makes a little point about how, the shape and the size of the cylinder, we should have seen it when we were above it, but it must have just been the fact that we were flying too fast that we didn't see it. Because, like, the exit to this cylinder is about as far from our plane as the entrance that we used to get into the city, which is somewhere else. So they're like, let's go up to the top, let's get out of here, let's get on the plane, let's get the hell back to the camp, and then out of here.
Yeah, and there's a couple of fun things that happens from the time they start running from the shot. Like they do catch a brief glimpse, and it's described as this thing that's oozing down a corridor with bioluminescence. Orbs of luminescence
it's
shining
bubbly,
like
it's made up. It's as if it's made out of bubbles, and then they also compare it to. Oh, there's a really cool part where Danforth starts shrieking, and he's just shrieking words, and it takes a while for the narrator to realize what he's saying. But basically, Danforth is yelling out the different subway stations that lead around in the area of the Miskatonic University, because what he then says is he's like, oh, the Shoggoth looks a lot like a subway train bearing down on us and going to run us over. And so then they continue to flee.
Yeah, and there's a fog that's enveloping them because the Shoggoth is completely consuming the width and the entirety of the corridor.
Yeah.
So it's pushing all the air in front of it. So this fog is just covering everything as they're running away. So as the fog envelopes them, by turning around and seeing the glowing orbs, it makes it look like an oncoming train.
Right.
And when they make their escape, that at first is the biggest horror of the story, that they see this. The Shoggoth is often described in the stories as something that even to look upon is to drive one insane.
Yeah.
And then they take off in the plane, and I don't know if you remember all of what happened at the very last part where they're leaving, and there's this one last glimpse that they catch off of a reflection of a cloud of something that is nestled in a larger mountain chain far away.
Yeah.
Or was it the larger mountain chain, or was it just the one that... Maybe they never actually see the other mountain chain. I'm not sure if they did.
No, they didn't see it, but they had an idea of where it was. Like they're like, oh yeah, based on what we've seen from the maps in the city and stuff like that, we suspect that this mountain range goes from here to here. That if you're approaching the Antarctic continent, you might be able to see a glimpse of it from this side of it at this longitude kind of thing. There's stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's implied that Danforth actually caught a glimpse of what was being reflected. He managed to look out and see it, and it was so horrifying to him that he wouldn't even speak of it to the person that was there with him, and it shook him up and messed him up for the rest of his life. Yeah,
he has a nervous breakdown. The narrator has to take the controls of the plane because Danforth's not in a condition to fly. Fortunately, he's able to pilot them through the pass back out toward the camp, and then I think I forget, but I think Danforth is then able to land them. He's able to return to his senses enough to land them at the camp, and then they all head back to the to the whaling ship to head back up north, basically.
Yeah, and they never tell the other members of the crew what they found over that mountain. They just
Yeah, that's right.
So as they're telling,
They make
as
up
the
a story.
story's
They
being
say that they
told-
got lost, basically.
Yeah, and as the story's being told, he's talking about how he would, this is going to be a surprise even to the people that they were there with. So this whole thing is just is just like, look, this is what we really found. Do not send this expedition. Horrible things will happen. This is the point of the story that's being told, is there's something so horrible out there and so possibly evil or deranged.
Yeah.
And it could mean the very end of humanity as we know it. And, they've got pictures and notes that they took, and he's saying in the story that we'll supply all of this as evidence, but we know that it's not going to be enough. There's going to be people saying that we faked these images and so forth.
Yeah.
But this is all I can think to do. We cannot send people there. And of course, since we're just getting a diary-style story out of this, we never know if that expedition actually sets out or not. We never get that part of the story.
No, I mean, because he's writing it in the attempt to prevent them from going there. So, yeah.
But yeah, it's like a little chunk of time cut out where it's like, this is an event that happened. This is the story of why we shouldn't go. And you, the reader, get to put it to your imagination whether anyone would have been convinced by this or not.
Right.
And that's one of the things that makes the story fun too, because if it's all, imagine you're in this world and it's all true, and something like this comes out in the newspapers, like what would people's reactions be? Largely people are probably not going to believe it for a start, but even if people do, it's like, well, what do we do? We can't not go, or what action do you take there? It's like there's almost nothing that the narrator can do that's going to prevent this expedition in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't think anyone nowadays would be convinced not to make this expedition based on what was said in this story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, you end up with like a military,
like, even if people believed
expedition or something. Yeah.
Yeah, even if people believed it, it'd be like, this is just more reason to go. Humanity's too curious about these things.
Well, so there's definitely an air of the danger of curiosity there, but there's also the I mean, like, if you believe what he's writing, then the danger is not that single Shoggoth in that city. The danger is waking up something that Shoggoth is afraid of, and that Shoggoth's creators were afraid of in the mountain range
in the true mountains of madness.
Yes. And so, like, it's one of those things where, if you believed it, then you'd be like, well, maybe we don't want to wake that up. You could take it either way if you wanted to. It's a question of whether the curiosity kills the cat, basically.
Yeah. And it's funny to think that the other more terrifying mountains with more terrifying things, for as small of a mention as it gets in the story, is the most important part of the story.
I mean, kind of, sort of. It's one of those things that Lovecraft probably put in there for the purposes of writing another story about it later.
Yeah, it could be. That could be the case. But it's like, Lovecraft is... his stories feel like slice of life for horror lovers.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. I mean, he's got some stories that are more than slice of life, but that's kind of what it feels like. It's just, here's a chunk of something weird that happened in someone's life, and you can imagine all of these things being something in the real world that nobody would ever know about.
Yeah.
It's just, it's presented really well in a sense that, like, for all you know, for all anyone knows, the entirety of the events in Charles Dexter Ward could be real. We'll just never know about it, because that's a lot of the point of some of these stories. But what makes Mountains of Madness so much fun is that this is actually something that is potentially world-ending, happening at the moment, that the entire world is being made aware of. It's a little bit different from his usual shtick.
Yeah. Well, it's got a little feel of War of the Worlds to it, kind of thing going on.
Yeah.
Right? Where, like, the voice is so honest and the voice is so accurate that it's like, someone could hypothetically kind of see this as something that might really be something to think about, or something that might be real. I don't know. I mean, I suppose the fact that it came out in, like, Weird Tales or whatever probably means that people didn't really... People understood that it was fiction, but at the same time, there's a definite air of realism to it. So,
and it really it seems to be the case. I'm pretty sure he wrote this story heavily inspired by the events of Operation High Jump, which this whole operation for these ships to head to Antarctica, and then they come back, and the story of what happened there just like gets a bit bent out of shape, and nobody gets a clear story of why they went there, what they were doing. It's just like, oh, this was just an expedition, but like nobody was ever told at the time, so it led to a lot of conspiracy theories. And
what's Operation High Jump?
Operation High Jump was Admiral Byrd taking a fleet to Antarctica to explore some kind of expedition. I don't remember what the purpose was. Just like a military training exercise, maybe, or something.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of conspiracy theories that ended up surrounding that, and a lot of those conspiracy theories may have been inspired by Lovecraft's writing of an expedition to Antarctica. But I feel like I don't know if it's established that he was inspired by that. It really seems like it, because I'm pretty sure it was like he wrote it right after that happened. I don't know. I'm actually wondering if I'm wrong now. Like, I'm pretty sure it happened before he wrote that story. It had to have. I mean, it's just too similar of events, of an expedition going to Antarctica. And
Operation High Jump, 1946 to 1947. No.
Oh, okay. Never mind then. What was I thinking of?
I don't know.
When was Mountains of Madness written?
31.
31?
Yeah. It was published in 36, but...
Where did I read that was... Maybe you know what? I think I read a story someone wrote where they were talking about how Lovecraft predicted Operation High Jump.
Oh, sure, that could be.
Unless I'm thinking of a different operation.
I mean, they don't seem to have... I mean, so Byrd's first expedition was in 1928 to 1930.
That might have been the expedition I'm thinking of then, because I seem to remember some kind of connection between Lovecraft and Byrd. I'm now looking
Byrd is
it up
mentioned in the story, so...
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess he was inspired by that expedition. But it was like an expedition that didn't really bear any fruit that anyone was aware of, other than whatever military purposes it might have served, which they wouldn't talk about, obviously. So, it makes good fodder for a good old-fashioned horror story of something happening somewhere where no one can witness it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember if...
Well, so Byrd left the military in 1927. He left the Navy in 1927, and he was a quote-unquote private person for these Antarctic expeditions in 28 through 1930.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm just on his wiki page.
Yeah. It in the end, it doesn't really matter. If it inspired the story, that's great, and it's important to point out, being a podcast about writing, that look for that cool stuff. Like if you read a story sometimes in the newspaper and it's just a perfectly normal story, maybe you can look at it and say, how can I make this weird?
Sure. Yeah,
People do it all the time. It's basically why
reasonable.
memes exist.
Yeah. Only, you need to have more words than most memes do.
Yeah, if you want to write a story about something. I mean, you can do the 6-word stories that everyone likes doing on Twitter, but I would recommend a bit longer form if you want to make craft out of it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just reading the end of the story, and basically Danforth has his breakdown. He's yelling, the Black Pit, the Carven Rim, the Proto-Shoggoths, the windowless solids with 5 dimensions, the Nameless Cylinder, the Elder Pharaohs, Yog-Sothoth, the Primal White Jelly, the Color Out of Space, the Wings, the Eyes in Darkness, the Moon Ladder, the Original, the Eternal, the Undying.
This was just Lovecraft documenting the titles of stories he wanted to write.
Basically, yeah. No, but it's like it's basically him saying that whatever was in the city that they explored, in this other mountain range that they didn't explore, there's something even worse, and he's just kind of underlining that by pulling out the proto Shoggoths is interesting, because the Shoggoths were supposedly made by the old ones, but if there were proto Shoggoths, then who made those, kind of thing.
Yeah, and what's the substance of a proto Shoggoth when the Shoggoth itself is pretty proto in its essence?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, I think proto in this sense means, I mean, the Shoggoth is protoplasmic, but I think proto Shoggoth.
No, I'm not talking
early...
protoplasmic. I mean, like they are a very basic jelly life form that can create parts for itself that it needs, that it can use as needed. So how do you get more base than that just to be a slime that, what is the proto? What comes before that?
Yeah.
Especially when you follow it up with something like windowless five dimensions or something.
Well, the thing is that, right, like the Shoggoths built brains for themselves, and they began to actually, respond to like verbal commands by the old ones. And so like the Shoggoth that they met in that city could at least hypothetically be reasoned with. But a proto-Shoggoth has no brain at all. It is simply an engine of destruction or construction, depending on whether or not you have the hypnotic capabilities to control it. And guess what? Nobody does.
So fun times.
Yeah, basically.
Gotta get one of those as a pet.
A pet Shoggoth?
Yeah.
It's just like a giant mutated slime mold.
Now I'm thinking like the proto Shoggoths were the original creatures that were baked in one of those like Santa Claus face cake pans.
Oh God.
I just imagine the Santa face Shoggoth, sliming its way towards you.
And you're like, I am terrified but also confused.
I'm terrified and also done. I'm done.
I'm out. I'm out, guys. Yeah.
All right. So this is our podcast.
Yep.
So I feel like we should either talk about your Mountains of Madness inspired book for a minute or two, or we should do an entire episode on that.
We could. I mean, I like this story a lot, and I wrote a novella that is basically, it's called What the Soul Still Fears, and I was thinking about the idea of like an alternate reality that's beyond ours, and I basically have the scientific aspects of it similar to At the Mountains of Madness, but the setting is a little bit different. Instead of being in like Antarctica, they're at a scientific facility in Italy, and they're working on some stuff, and they discover some really weird like physics stuff. They're like, well, this is odd. There is no, because like when Lovecraft was writing, he talks about like the interstellar ether and things like that, and like that was all eventually kind of sort of disproven in insofar as you can disprove something scientifically, which is kind of iffy for an inductive method. But like the idea is that like, well, we couldn't see any effect of it, so it probably doesn't exist. But what if someone found something that made it look like there might actually be an ether? And what if that ether was a sign of a world tucked away from ours, but still very much alive? And so I kind of go with that. And like, I have the themes of oldness, right? Like your brain, the lizard part of your brain has a reaction part in it that responds to, a movement in the dark, or like, the fluttering of a moth. Like I don't know about you, but like, for some reason, my body recoils when like a moth flies at me, even though I know the moth can't possibly harm me at all. Right? Like I know it's a harmless object, and yet I have to consciously, put effort into not like jumping when it flies at me. And like that's like something in your lizard brain that's like, this is something that evolution taught us long before we were people, long before we had a cerebrum at all, and when we were just like a little blump of neural tissue that reacts to things. And what if there was something that caused a fear in you that was even older than that? That's kind of the theme that story plays around with. So yeah, it was a fun little novella. I'm thinking about writing a sequel now because it was a lot of fun. And yeah, What the Soul Still Fears, you can find it, on places where books are sold. Ebooks.
I would love to see how a sequel to that would work, because it was I loved it when it got to the weird bit at the end, and it was just like, oh, this is what's going on. Because you kind of wrote it in a way where it's like, I still don't really understand what's going on here, but it's definitely like one of them. Oh, this is something horrific.
The main character spends about 3 seconds in experiencing this side world, and he's the only one that basically survives the situation.
Yeah.
No, I'm thinking about writing a sequel where, like just to open it up, like he took all of the notes. Like, he couldn't bring himself to destroy the originals. He couldn't bring himself to destroy all of the notes, but he basically made copies of them and destroyed the originals and brought the copies with him back to America. And I'm thinking about just opening up a story with him coming into his house and discovering that the place has been torn apart, and he's like, "Uh-oh."
I can say for sure, and I mean, I don't know if it counts as a biased opinion since I know you and we're good friends, but I mean, it was a good read. It had a very good Lovecraftian horror feel to it.
Yeah, I mean, I really had a desire to write something where my scientific knowledge was useful, and having a story where you like reprove the luminiferous ether, I thought was a really fun idea, because I could throw in some like laser stuff in there and some physics and not too much, but just enough that's like that like a real scientist would be like, wait, what's going on here? This is a little strange, you know?
I also like the fact that both of us have used the luminiferous ether in stories.
Yeah.
Like I've been running that gag since oh god, what was the first story I did that with? So I remember reading about it, and it was that and the Bohr model that for atoms that like both inspired some of the science fiction I wrote, where I was just like, you know what? Okay, maybe people don't think this is real anymore, but I'm going to go ahead and pretend that it is for the purposes of my stories.
Sure.
And I'm glad I'm not the only one that does that. So I think a lot of people, when they write science fiction, when they are scientists, they want to restrict themselves to the current knowledge that everyone is going with.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It's always refreshing when someone doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that also I wanted to try to do as an exercise, was I do a lot of fairly hard science fiction, and I kind of wanted to try, what if I was a little bit more fanciful while still maintaining a little bit of that hard edge to it. So it was fun.
I'm not going to lie, I think that I like both of your writing styles. I think I liked this one a little bit better, but I'm not sure, because your Hyacinth story is still might be my favorite. Yeah, you should really compile a book of Derelict Project stories at some point.
Yeah, well, I'm finishing up a Derelict Project novel right now, so.
Oh, okay. I forgot you were. I keep thinking you're doing short stories for all.
No. I've been wanting to do a Derelict Project novel length thing for a while, and so that's been my project for the last year or so. It's been slow, but I'm almost done. I'm editing now, and kind of doing like one chapter per day kind of rate, and I think the whole thing has like 22 chapters, and I think that it's like I think it's complete. It's just that I need to add a little bit more description here and there, a little bit more character stuff, kind of fiddle around with it a bit. So I'm going through and doing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that turnaround time. I've been writing the same book for about 6 years now, and I keep interrupting it by writing a ton of short stories in between.
Yes, but you're also employed.
Yes, actually, since we're on that subject, I know this has nothing to do with Mountains of Madness. Once again, I think I've said this before, but tip to anyone who wants to be a writer: if you're making money at a job and you have time to write, and you can publish things that you aren't necessarily making money on because you don't have the time to market it,
yeah,
that's what hobbies are. Enjoy it. You don't have to give up being a writer because you need to work your full-time job. A lot of people get in this mindset where it's like, I'm not a real author if I'm not making money off of this. But it's like, do you want it to be your job? That's fine. But do you want to is that all you want out of writing? Like, I love writing stories. I'm never going to stop doing it. And I make enough money to where I don't need to give up my hobby for any reason. I can
Right.
go to work, and then I could come home and come up with stories to write and write them and share them with friends. I've got print books for books that I've never even sold 10 copies of, and it doesn't bother me one bit. It's just like, yep, here you go. Here's a book you can read. Like I buy my own copies and give them to friends, knowing full well that they would actually pay for them. Except you, because you know what trash I am, so you're like, nah, I'm not touching it.
I think I have bought all of your books.
You have. You're my only friend that has all of my books, actually. And I would buy yours, but you keep putting most of yours out for free.
Well, I put all the shorts out for free. The novellas are not free. But...
Yeah, and I can't blame you because I do that too. But
yeah, I mean, so I mean, I'm thinking at this point about possibly putting together a collection of shorts to sell that, but I don't know. I haven't quite. I'm really focused on trying to get the novel finished, so I'm kind of slowed down on other stuff right now.
Yeah, everyone has a different way of doing it. Some people want to go all in, and it's like they want to make writing their career, and they're gonna do the research, do the marketing, do the writing, get an editor and get everything in proper shape. Self-publish, or maybe find an agent, get published through a publisher. It's you got to figure out what works for you, and you also have to be willing to accept that sometimes people don't want to read what you write. Or sometimes you just haven't gotten the word out there enough. It's not a big deal if you're treating it as a hobby. If you want it to be your life, you really, really, really got to work at it. Like way harder than I work at it. I just write the story and I edit it and then I put it out there. That's what I like to do.
Even harder than I work at it, and that's a problem. All right. Well, do you have any particular story that you want to talk about of yours before we close up?
The only things that I have, I mean, almost everything I write now has a touch of Lovecraft in it, just because I fell in love with those stories overnight.
Yeah.
I have a collection. Well, I have a couple of short stories with a Shoggoth that molded itself into human form and tried to live among human beings. They weren't really like unknown horror stories. I'm planning on building up to that in some of the later stories, but I wrote a few
comedy.
Yeah. I wrote a few on the periphery that are just the Shoggoth interacting with people, and maybe one or two people discover that there's something weird about this person. And I had one story where he takes off from a bar after hanging out with some friends. He talks a little weird sometimes, and they make fun of him for it. And he hears about a kidnapping taking place, and so he's almost like a superhero in that story, where he takes off on someone's motorcycle, gets to this highway, and jumps into a van and rescues this girl that's been kidnapped and kills the two drivers, and then he runs off. And nobody knows what happened, and the little girl is just like, no, there was some kind of monster in that van. It just ripped these guys to pieces. and so his friends meet up with him later, and they're like, what the heck happened? And, one of them doesn't really realize what happened, and the other is like, what the heck are you?
Right.
I wrote a second one where she kind of knows what he is, and they go to a beach, and this all takes place on like a giant asteroid that's one of Earth's colonies, floating through space. So there were these giant sea creatures when they first arrived that they thought they'd eradicated. One of them shows up at this beach, like out in the distance. It's like sinking boats and just attacking boats that are out on the water. And so the Shoggoth seeps into the water and goes and takes it out. And it's just a short, fun one where the girl's like, well, what are you going to do against that thing? He goes, there's nothing in the sea that can swim better than me. Trust me, I got this.
Yeah.
And that was the one that you made the joke about. You pictured the giant sea creature being dragged down into the ocean to the tune of some 80s sitcom music. Yeah, that's like the only really direct references I think that I have to anything from Lovecraft. When I go to write a longer version of that, I wanted to do a story where I open with a team of 3 people descending on a spaceship in Antarctica to find out what happened to a crew that went there 100 years previous. They're going to discover that particular Shoggoth, sitting around these frozen bodies. It just, there's like a human being sitting there, and there's these other 3 human beings that are frozen and dead. And they have no idea how this one person could be sitting here and surviving, and how he survived. And they don't realize right away that he's actually a monster that was mimicking these human beings and was, like, kind of investigating how to make their brains, how to match what they were so that he could become human.
Yeah.
Up to and including trying to master language, which he hasn't fully grasped by the time this team gets there, so they can't communicate with him right away. But, most of the story, they think he's human, but they start to get hints that something's off about him.
Ah, okay.
And then I'm just going to have some weird, like, monster show up that they have to run from, and they end up taking this person with them to a colony.
Yeah,
so
okay.
That's how I'm going to open it. And then it's just going to be a couple of short stories like that, taking place with, like, what would happen if a Shoggoth was living among humans. So nothing else really comes to mind. I do a lot more funny stories than horror stories.
Yeah.
I do have the Rackon is going to get a sequel soon. I've already started it.
Mm-hmm.
I've written several short stories with the characters from the Rackon, and that's all space horror.
Yeah.
And of course, like I said, touch of Lovecraft in everything, so there's a bit of that in there. I'm struggling to think of anything else that really has any prominent Lovecraft in it. Like, I've got an entire universe of characters that I'm working on doing action, and kind of like The Good Guy. There's a lot of stories I'm doing with the Peril family.
Sure.
Where they're going... I'm going to kind of hint that there's Lovecraftian stuff in that world, and it has to do a lot with what's going on. I kind of connected that short book I wrote, Sylvia Saga, to all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that has to do with monsters that you can't really see being killed by robots that are too beautiful for humans to be able to injure. A lot of mind games, more or less, that I'm going to play with things like that.
Sure.
I had that creature in the Rackon that nobody could remember if it got out of range of them. They would forget it existed.
Right.
I kind of had that at the end of Sylvia Saga. One of them was being built as Sylvia walked through the hall after she died.
Yeah.
That's about it, though. I don't really have any direct naming yet of things like Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth. I'm planning on working some of that stuff in, but I've also got my own set of monsters that I'm going to be parading around in a couple of upcoming stories. You haven't read Ibralina and the Pixie Lands yet, so
no, I haven't.
But you'll start to see hints of it in that book.
Mm-hmm. All right.
As far as direct Lovecraft goes, your stories are much more like, this is actually just pretty much unknown cosmic horror stuff.
Yeah. Indeed. All right. Well, I think we can call that an episode.
Yeah, that was a fun one, as always.
Indeed. It's a really good story. We've kind of gone about it in a way that was not... that does spoil parts of it, but at the same time is we were so disjointed about it that maybe it's still worth reading. Like, I just read it for a second. I just read it again, in the last couple of days. It's free to read, so go read it. Go read At the Mountains of Madness. Lovecraft is excellent.
It's public domain. If we really need to have, like... If we need to skip a week, I can record the entirety of that book in audio format, and we could put it out as a podcast.
Oh, that would probably be a little bit outside the scope of what we're trying to do here, but, it's a thing.
Yeah, there's plenty of reason to go read that book if you enjoy a bit of mystery and horror.
If you like Lovecraft at all, you should read it. If you haven't read it and you like Lovecraft at all, you should read it. If you like mystery and horror, you should read it. If you like good descriptions, you should read it. There's an almost uncountable number of reasons. The number of reasons to read At the Mountains of Madness is larger than the number of bubbles that make up a Shoggoth.
And I can safely say that if you're the type of person who thinks Hop on Pop is the height of literature, you're probably not going to enjoy it very much.
I mean, sure, that's true.
But you still might.
You should still read it anyway.
I'm assuming that anyone listening to this at least has a capacity for reading. I know that you and I have both talked before about how we grew up in situations where we would be the only reader in our entire classroom of peers.
Yeah.
And the only ones with any curiosity whatsoever. I'm assuming that anyone that took the time to listen to our nonsense here would actually enjoy reading. And if you enjoy reading and you enjoy stories, and
yes, I assume that our audience are largely avid readers and avid writers.
Yeah. So there's something to enjoy.
Good times. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. This has been the Wordy Pair Podcast. I'm Rudy.
And I'm Justin.
And we are out. See you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.